So I was asked to talk about yield grading, and I'm pretty passionate about yield grading and the need to update what we're doing because what we have been doing is a little bit out of date. And so I've got a little history here, and then we're going to go into some issues and then maybe some opportunities. So we'll start with history. So in our world, and I say our world includes meatheads, and so the meatheads, we had a little small RMC back in the corner earlier this morning. The meatheads of the world decided in the 1950s that we needed to include some objective yield measurement of the carcass. We were only focused on quality prior to that, and so how do we objectively determine how much of the carcass ends up in a box? And you got to go back in time and realize that back in that day, it wasn't how much ends up in a box, it was just how much am I selling? Because prior to about 1967, everything was sold as a carcass, either whole or sides or quarters. So in that era, we were determining in a larger scale, maybe a carload of cattle, what's the yield of these outcomes. And then in the mid-1950s, at the 1952 RMC, they adopted these 7 measures. And I'm not going to read those measures, but the point was the meats community decided we're going to start taking data and assessing these outcomes. And then there was a report later, 4 years later, in fact, at the 1956 American Society of Animal Production meetings. That's what we know as ASAS today. And in that report, they said, hey, we've got something going here. There's 459 carcasses that we've put together, and this is looking promising. There was a subsequent report in 1960 at the same program, and this is really the one that set everything in motion. And I want you to highlight a couple of things here. Number one, the Murphy, what we would call the Murphy paper, is the one that ultimately generated the yield grade equation. And so we generated that from 162 carcasses. And I want you to think about what an animal would have looked like pre-1960. So I can assure you that Dr. Warner and Dr. Wiegand and all of our colleagues across the country, if we reported it in 1960, we did it prior to that. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. You don't get it exactly right and do it in the same year. My point being, it's a pre-1960 animal. If you think back to what cattle looked like back then, that is what your cattle are being measured against today. So I want to put that in your head. So in that era, they were harvested in one location, transported somewhere else, and deboned. Not the way we would do it today, but that's neither here nor there. They were a mixture of steers, heifers, and cows, all quality grades, very small carcasses. To the maximum weight of that era was a 900-pound carcass in those data, so less than the mean today. Both bone-in and boneless cuts. There was a ½ inch of fat left on the thick cuts and a ½ inch of fat left on the thin cuts. And they measured 17 different outcomes. They came up with 4 that were important: back fat, percentage kidney, pelvic, heart fat, carcass weight, and ribeye area. And they came up with an equation. So the original equation was to predict boneless, closely trimmed, rib, loin, round, and chuck. Well, you get a frequency. So a percentage, 51, 55, somewhere in the middle, and it says this percent of the carcass becomes boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. Part of the reality of that is they did not include the brisket, the plate, the flank, or grind. A large portion of the value of the carcass was not included. It was only boneless, closely trimmed, rib, loin, round, and chuck. Then in 1962, a proposal was initiated to try this out. Does yield grading work? Does it add value to our industry? And there was a 1-year trial that began in 1962, and by all accounts it was successful. Because in June of 1965, yield grading began. Also in June of 1965, you had to rib the carcass. Quality grade is a whole different discussion that I'm not getting into today, but pre-1965, you could sell a graded carcass, prime choice, select, actually good, etc., that was unribbed. but that was a different evaluation day. And the carcass had to be ribbed. Yield grading was connected to quality grading. If you're going to do one, you're going to do the other. That was unconnected in 1989 when Monfort was experimenting with hot fat trim, and remains uncoupled today. You can do quality grading or yield grading or both or neither. It's completely up to you because it's a voluntary system. Then, beginning in about September of 2009, camera grading or vision instrument grading went live. It had been tested for well over 10 years and improved, and processing capacity became better, cameras became better, resolution became better, all of the intricacies and the details of making the assessments got better and better. And now today we have a tremendous variability in how things actually get done. So I can take you to a plant today where there is no camera, and it's a traditional human grader stamping every carcass for both quality grade and yield grade. I can take you to another plant where it's in-house use only. They're evaluating every single carcass, but they don't do anything with it outside of maybe some internal math. The human grader is still doing everything, quality grade and yield grade. I can take you to a plant where the human's doing quality and the camera is doing yield grade. And I can take you to a plant where the camera's doing everything and the human's watching it and agreeing or disagreeing. And I can take you to a plant where the camera's doing everything and there is no human. My point in saying all that is there's a tremendous number of iterations today, and the variety of what happens is not consistent within plant and or within company day after day. So there's a little bit of variety technically out there. However, I want you to think about the two words in red. Camera grading improved our accuracy and it improved our repeatability. That's important. We'll do a much better job with the camera of getting it right and getting it consistent. And that's why most people have accepted this technology and embraced it. We do a better job of getting it right. We do a better job of getting it right consistently. And so that's where we're at with the camera technology. So let's get into a little bit of the economics of yield grading and what it can do for the math. So I've got some images here. Yield grade 1 on the far left and a yield grade 2 next to it on the right. In the top green line, you see the minimum and the maximum premium. Somebody has no premium for yield grade 1 in this country. At least one grid has nothing. And at least one grid is giving $8 per hundredweight when you bring a yield grade 1 carcass to market. The average you see in the value below that is $3.35. Yield grade 2, again, somebody's giving nothing, somebody's giving $4, and the average is $1.58. Something to think about is why do we care about this so much? So I want you to think about the image on the left where it illustrates the yield grade 1. If you take the bones off of that, the rib bone and the vertebra, and you're left with just the longissimus and a little back fat, that's basically what goes in a bag today. The yield grade 2, and then you're going to see a 3 and a 4 and a 5 later, they get trimmed to that same yield grade 1 spec before they go into a bag, into a box, and out the door. So we're taking some level of fat off in addition to the bones when we produce these products. And that excess fat trim becomes tallow. I'll talk about that in a little bit. The other side of the coin, a yield grade 4 and a 5 are a discount in our system. You'll notice on the far left, yield grade 4, somebody is taking at least $10 off. That's the minimum discount in all grids across the country right now. And the maximum is $15. You see the average there at $12.45. Then the yield grade 5, the fattest yield grade we have today, $10 to $25, average is $17.82. If you've noticed anything thus far in these images, the big change is in back fat. And the math says that the back fat depth is 73% of the answer. So when I'm teaching live animal evaluation to young students, I tell them, if you can get the finish right, you can get the yield grade right. You can sort cattle in a pen live based on finish, and you can get pretty darn close to the yield grade. So then let's look at the value on an average carcass. Yesterday's average weight was 967 pounds, so I used a 950-pound carcass. It's pretty close to where we're at in this country right now. So if I apply those same premiums to a yield grade 1 and 2, and the same discounts to a yield grade 4 and 5 that I reported as the average, that's what you have right here. The yield grade equation was linear, like straight line. You'll notice that's not a linear line. There's a subtle carrot for bringing a higher yielding animal, and there's a pretty big economic stick for bringing a lower yielding animal. When in reality, it's a linear transformation. If you apply that same logic to the entire country, here's the potential value change based on today's proportion. So you'll see I've got each image, yield grade 1 through 5, and the number above that is where we were in the entirety of 2023. So USDA reports these values. I can show you how to get there on USDA Market News, and you can find those absolute numbers. That was all cattle in 2023. So we're about 3.7% yield grade 1s, so on and so forth, all the way over to 2.7% yield grade 5s. I want to make a comment real quick. Cattle are fatter than they've ever been. I'll get to that just in a moment. But today's market suggests that you have a threefold chance of producing a prime carcass than you do a yield grade 1 carcass. Cattle are the fattest ever in recorded history. There's some good things that are coming out of that, and there's a few unintended consequences. I'll mention those as well. The other thing I want to point out is the number at the bottom. About 23.5% of the cattle are USDA yield graded. So if 23.5% are USDA yield graded, who did the rest of them? The camera. Okay. 23.5% are stamped by a human. The balance are determined by the camera. So there's some of that iteration there. Look at the blue bars and the value premium, and look at the blue bars and the discount that is taken away. In reality, this is about a $650 million change in value, up and down. You'll notice that the discounts far exceed the premiums for yield. And that's where we are today. So let's get into some of the changes and the challenges with this system. Some of you might remember an animal like the one in the top left. I never saw that animal. I was born in 1975. But the animal in the top left was the reserve champion steer at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. Reserve champion. I couldn't find a picture of the champion. Reserve champion in 1959. And I understand that show steers are not the exact image of our industry, but they're closer than you might think. That was probably the most popular animal type in 1959. A short, early maturing Hereford. So if we published the yield grade equation in 1960, what was the most likely creature that went into that equation? A short, early maturing, overfinished Hereford. The data don't actually tell us what the 162 cattle were, but by all accounts, they were probably very close to this creature right here. Today, or very recently, that's what a champion steer looks like. And I could go to a lot of feedlots and find an animal that looks just like that. That wouldn't be far from normal today. So I want you to think about how much the animal has changed in and of itself. In 1959, Hereford dominated. Angus was a distant second, and I honestly don't know where your group was. Probably not even on the radar. Didn't exist. Not on the radar. Yeah. They hadn't come here yet. So things have changed dramatically in animal type, in genetics, in improvement. Hereford obviously does not dominate today. So things have changed. Another big change for you to consider is all of the cool things we do at a feed yard. You talked to my colleagues yesterday, and I believe you might have even been able to see the feed yard. But implants had just been approved in 1956. They were not widely adopted. It was a strange new technology in 1960 when all of this happened. Today, arguably widespread, 95-ish% adoption rate. One of the key ingredients in the one on the right, trenbolone acetate, hadn't even been developed yet. TBA is a synthetic testosterone that dramatically improves muscle growth, feed to gain, average daily gain, important traits to the feeding community. Again, it hadn't been developed yet. Steam flaked corn was rocket science. We didn't know how to push cattle on gelatinizing the starch molecules yet. Distiller's grains hadn't even been thought of. And the technology on the lower right, beta agonists, that hadn't happened yet. My point in saying all this is the technology of feeding cattle has changed dramatically. So the animal looks nothing today like it did when the yield grade equation was adopted. The other big change is cattle are bigger. Much bigger. Every year we add 5.2 pounds to the steers, we add 5.5 pounds to the heifers. In my lifetime, the mean carcass will most likely exceed 1,500 pounds. In my lifetime, it will most likely exceed 1,500 pounds. If you noticed the signs in the meat lab yesterday, what was the maximum weight per space on the rail? 3,000 pounds. So when I designed that, I was thinking about the future. Not about me, but about my successors. Down the line, they're going to be killing some really big critters. We've killed one animal at 2,600 pounds. We've killed one at 2,800 pounds. They're out there. It's not a rarity anymore. I know of one cattle feeder who's already pushing groups of cattle, and I don't mean small groups, like thousands of cattle, to 2,200 pounds. Live, not carcass. 2,200 pounds live. That's still a big carcass. So let me ask by a show of hands, how many of you used one of those in a carcass eval class back in the day? Or maybe taught with one? A few of you know what I'm talking about. A ribeye grid, right? So I want you to focus on the values on the right. We've got a carcass weight and a ribeye area. When the equation was developed, it was assumed, albeit incorrectly, that cattle grow in a linear manner. Well, my advisor taught me the cattle do not grow in a linear manner. They grow in a curvilinear manner. Quadratic, maybe a power function, but it's definitely not linear. And we illustrated that several years ago, that it's actually a quadratic function of ribeye area in comparison to carcass weight. Now the white line is the 162 animals used to develop the yield grade equation and their assumed growth plane. And the black dots is 485,000 cattle that we evaluated and measured and reported here. The curve's a little different. What I want you to take away from that is, at the carcass weights we're at today, we're over here on the right. And cattle don't have enough ribeye for the weight they're at. So we mathematically get more and more yield grade 4s and 5s. Another issue is the cameras are programmed incorrectly. Allow me to explain. The animal on the left and the animal on the right are the same animal. And what I want you to focus on is the blue box on the bottom. The blue box on the bottom is where the fat depth was determined. The camera is programmed to take the leanest animal. So if there's a hide pull and a fat tear, the camera automatically takes the leanest one. And you get data back on that animal. When in reality, the other side was the truest value of back fat. Cattle are always fatter than the camera data suggests. Always. Because the camera is programmed to choose the leanest side, which is in favor of the animal, but if you're trying to make genetic improvement or selection, you're getting under-finished data. That's a problem. They know about it, but have failed to do anything about it. So let's get into the crux of what I was trying to get to here. If we apply the yield grade equation to beef-type cattle that your group would generate, it predicts approximately 40% of the variation in red meat yield, which is better than anything else right now. Not great, but it's the best thing we have. If we apply it to a dairy-type animal, in this case, purebred, calf-fed Holsteins, it predicts absolutely 0% of the variation in red meat yield. And the primary reason being, selection pressure for dairy cattle says put your fat reserves internally, fat around the stomach, fat around the intestines, fat around the kidneys, throughout the pelvic cavity and around the heart. Internal fat, if you will. And do not put fat on the back. If you go to any dairy, you probably think most dairy cows are extremely lean. They look lean. You can see their hip bones. And in traditional visual appraisal, you're right. The reality is they might be chock full of fat internally, and you don't see that until slaughter at the gut table. Dairy cattle could easily have 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12% internal kidney pelvic heart fat. The numbers are sometimes boggling of the mind. They have much more fat than you realize, and it's internal. So real quick, let me mention other systems that other countries have. I'm going to first mention that Canada had a yield grade system, and they changed it, and it became our system. Let me explain. In 1992, the Canadian government did a study, and they said, hey, we're going to predict lean yield. We're going to use this ruler. We're going to measure fat thickness and muscle length and depth and get to a geometrical muscle score. And their system predicted 22% of the variability in red meat yield. 22. So actually moving to ours was an improvement. And they did that. January 15th, 2019. They just redid their ruler, adjusted for KPH, and applied their standards to ours. And they did that because they're trying to create some harmony between the systems. They were already using our quality grading system. They just have different terms for it. So now we're a more aligned Middle and North American system. Our friends to the south haven't done anything like that yet. Our friends in Japan also have a system. They have yield grades A, B, and C. They evaluate the carcass for different parameters. This is quite unique. I've tested this twice. It is no better than doing nothing. This absolutely doesn't work. And our friends in Europe have a different system. Those of you who were in our 104 classroom yesterday, you saw a carcass made of fiberglass and foam. JBS actually bought this technology in about 2000 to try and improve yield grading because they knew the yield grade wasn't cutting it. They bought this system, put it in at JBS in Greeley. That carcass you saw yesterday was the calibration tool that they used to set the camera. So you'll notice the carcass on the left is a bull, and the carcass on the right is a very lean cow. And their system is built totally on muscle conformation. And there's some adjustments to this, E plus, E average, E minus, et cetera, et cetera. So you get 15 scores instead of 5, but that's how they do it. So I'm going to ask the question, what's next? And I don't know exactly what's next, but I want you to know that Dr. Warner, your next speaker, and I are on a committee that is sponsored by NCBA, and we've met twice now. In our first meeting, there were kind of two camps. Camp A wanted to just reparameterize the equation. Let's start over. Let's have more cattle. Let's make it of today's weights and of today's breed types and appropriate mix of genetics. And then Camp B was, let's blow it up and start over. And in our second meeting, the consensus was, let's not put a Band-Aid over what we got. Let's blow it up and start over. And so I can't tell you what we're going to go to, because we don't know yet. But hopefully, if I were to come back to your meeting in the next 5 years, that answer would already be known and hopefully actually being implemented. So be ready for a change to occur in yield grading. It's coming. I'm going to tie onto that because a lot of this has to do with producing tallow. And we're producing more tallow than ever. I've got some terms up there you might not have heard of. Notice there's an acronym that says EBF. That's common terminology in the world of ruminant nutrition. EBF is a measure of doneness. Yesterday, I fed you steaks of different doneness, right? Which one did you like? Rare? Well? Or microwave? Not the microwave, right? Dale, we had a lot of fun yesterday. So, I want you to think of EBF as a live cattle doneness indicator. Most of the research would say at approximately 29% EBF, an animal has the ability to grade choice if the genetic capacity is there. I've done 2 large-scale studies where we grew animals to different endpoints and dropped them in a grinder and actually measured the empty body fat. And I want to highlight those 2 studies real quick here. In the top line is our Holstein study. Black line, black dots. And the bottom line is a Charolais Angus study. We've not yet used Simmentals. White or gray line and white or gray dots. And I want you to step back and understand that the relationship between marbling and empty body fat is the same for both a Holstein and a Charolais Angus cross. Those curves are identical. But which one's actually fatter at every point? The Holstein. Again, Holsteins look leaner when you look at traditional visual appraisal of outward appearing fat depots. but they're tremendously fat internally, fat that you don't see. The next point is, for every 100-point change in marbling, so if I go from select to low choice, or low choice to mid choice, etc., I increase empty body fat about 5.8%. So you want marbling in one spot in the ribeye to improve the grading outcome of that animal. Amen. The reality is they get fatter everywhere else, much fatter. Much, much fatter internally, much, much fatter subcutaneously, much, much, much fatter intermuscularly. Fat accrues everywhere. So we're producing more and more and more tallow. How much more? Well, I've plotted here the tallow production estimated at every National Beef Quality Audit thus far. And so right now, at the most recent audit, we're producing approximately 450 pounds of tallow per carcass. That's a lot of fat. So and it'll show up in two ways, and I've mushed those together. Fat that comes off on the kill floor. Think at the gut table, brisket trim, round trim, loin trim, all of the fat that gets taken off on the kill floor. Before the inspection stamp, we sell that as inedible tallow. Historically, that was put right back in the cattle feeding ration at about 3 to 4% for energy. More recently, we are subsidizing that as a country to make it into biodiesel. And it's too expensive now to put into most rations, at least at the 3 to 4% level. Edible tallow, that's that is cut off the animal after the inspection stamp. So the animal is passed, inspected. That goes into soaps, lotions, cosmetics, food. It is widespread throughout your life. And that value has changed over time. So, Chip, I've plotted here tallow value on the bottom, price per pound, carcass value in the top, price per pound. And Chip posed the question to me back in the spring, are packers actually making cattle fatter so they can sell more tallow? And the answer in a word is, if they do, they're idiots. Because the math simply doesn't work on this. A carcass today is worth about $3.10. The tallow is selling for about 57 cents. So if I pay $3.10 for every pound of that animal, the carcass coming in, and then I cut off the tallow and sell it for 57 cents, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that math is not going to work out. You cannot do that. They're not making cattle fatter to hit tallow outcomes. They're making cattle fatter to hit quality outcomes. Our consumers want higher quality continually. Tallow is an outcome of that quality. And I'm going to leave you with a thought-provoking outcome. How many of you are familiar with galactorrhea? Nobody. So galactorrhea is an unintended consequence of making cattle continually fatter year after year after year. Galactorrhea is the lactation of an animal that's not pregnant. And if you look at the data in the chart, you'll notice that 2 of those can never be pregnant because they're steers. The blue bar is percentage of those criteria that are lactating currently. We've evaluated about 20,000 cattle in this little audit, and 14 and a half technically, percent of the native steers, like steers from you guys, are lactating. 29.5% of native heifers, 16% of native steers, and basically every other dairy cross heifer is lactating. They're not pregnant. We've tested for that. They're fat. If your fat cells accumulate enough, they produce estrone. Estrone is a simple conversion to estrogen. This is well documented in human obesity literature. You get fat enough, you produce enough estrone, you begin lactating. We are pushing cattle so far now that frequency of animal is now lactating. Pontificate that.